All right, so welcome to our presentation on learning transfer. So we're going to start off just looking at what is transfer, how is it defined, and then a couple different types of transfer. So we found this really simple definition, and we found that it summarized it quite nicely. So what is transfer? And it says that it's the ability to extend what has been learned in one context to new contexts. So when does transfer occur? Transfer occurs when the learner abstracts common features, adds this information to memory, and then uses this information in a different context. So different types of transfer. The first that we're going to talk about is positive versus negative transfer. So positive transfer happens when the learning that takes place in one context actually improves the performance in a different context. Negative transfer is going to be the opposite of that. So when the learning that takes place in one context reduces the performance in a different context. Another set of types of transfer is near versus far. So near transfer occurs when the learning in one context is closely related to another context. And then far transfer is going to be when you're learning in one context, and then you can take what you've learned and translate it to a completely different context. And then we've got reflexive transfer versus mindful transfer. So reflexive is kind of that more automatic transfer. It occurs when the context leads to a triggered retrieval of the information from a prior context, and then mindful transfer is when it takes more of an effort. So you're making a conscious effort to transfer your prior knowledge to a new context.
This part of the talk deals with why transfer is such a complex process, why students fail to transfer knowledge between subjects. In the first part, we're going to talk about the complexity of the notion of transfer. Transfer is considered to be a very complex subject because it involves several factors and variables. Transfer, for example, may mean transfer within a subject area but between concepts, or it might be transfer between subjects. In addition, we could be referring to transfer from school to the world at large. There are several types of transfer to consider: near transfer, far transfer, specific transfer, general transfer, mindful transfer. In addition, when considering transfer, according to Perkins, we must consider not just if transfer happens, but under what conditions transfer happens and what the mechanisms of transfer are. There are several barriers to transfer. Successful transfer, according to Ross in 1991, requires requisite knowledge of principles underlying the domain. The greater the knowledge, both factual and conceptual, on a subject, the more expert the learner will be, and the greater the opportunities for metacognition and transfer. So there are several barriers which inhibit or interfere with this process. The first barrier I'm going to talk about is contextualization. School subjects are often taught in isolation from each other. This over-contextualization is a great barrier towards transfer. Students find it difficult to see relationships between subjects if they're not given guidance and opportunities and practice in finding those links. Prior experience may inhibit transfer of knowledge. Culture and home life might inhibit transfer of knowledge from school to the world at large. If students never talk about science at home, if their parents say, "Oh, science was always a tough subject for me, I don't understand it, it's okay," then they aren't going to see its particular relevance to their world, or they're not going to see how it relates to anything outside, and therefore that will inhibit their transferability. In addition to those kinds of things, there are also many misconceptions or oversimplifications that occur as they learn science in a simplified manner in lower grades. For example, when students in British Columbia are taught the Bohr model of the atom, and they are told that the third shell holds 8 electrons, this leads to some problems further down the road when you teach them that in actual fact the third electron shell can hold more than 8 electrons, and that electron shells are not these hard, concrete, fast things, that they overlap and they're regions of probability. And all of a sudden they have this idea in their head of a shell, and it is inhibiting their ability to move forward to this idea that no, it's not like an eggshell. It's not a barrier. There's this region where you might be more likely to find an electron. And those kinds of oversimplifications in prior years interfere with their ability to see things and to transfer what they do know into a new context. And so every year seems like a new year to them. Passive transmission of knowledge. Roll and Elvin have pointed out that studies have shown that a cycle of exploration followed by an explanation, followed by an opportunity to apply the material, will increase the opportunity for students to be able to transfer knowledge. The learner needs to be engaged in the material. Simply telling students the material they need to know limits their ability to internalize that knowledge, and if they haven't internalized the knowledge, transfer is much less likely. In addition to creating opportunities for deeper understanding, metacognition is also required for transfer. Overly structured classes in which we have sort of the sage on the stage type of presentation of material limits those opportunities. It limits the chance for students to think about what they know and why they know what they know. And this ends up presenting the information in isolation from the world at large, whereas, as Gilbert, Bolte, and Pilot point out, if students are encouraged and required to make those connections, to think about their knowledge, transfer is increased. The last barrier I'm going to talk about is lack of relevance, and it really sort of informs and overlaps all of the other barriers I was talking about. In particular, when we isolate knowledge, when we teach knowledge in ways that treats it as if it is some sort of single isolated fact, no matter how complex, we are removing the relevance of the material. And schools often do this in a very artificial manner, and this tends to remove any relevance for the students. By removing the relevance, we remove the opportunities for the students to even see that that knowledge is transferable.
I'm going to talk about specific things we can do to help students develop the ability to transfer. And I just really like this quote at the bottom. I think it summed it up quite nicely. If students are to be successful, and if schooling is to have a significant impact on their lives, it is essential that students regularly transfer what they learn. So it just kind of highlights the importance of helping our students develop these skills. All right, so first thing, we've got a picture most people are probably quite familiar with, connect the dots. So as we've talked about in the presentation, one of the biggest things that makes transfer problematic is this idea of disconnected learning. So like this image, if we don't draw connections between what students are learning, then they're not going to see the bigger picture. So again, it's super important that we try to provide connections as much as possible. So it would be ideal to try to connect information to other disciplines, other ideas, everyday life. We also need to factor in individual, social, and cultural aspects. The design needs to be relevant to the student and to their connections. Another thing that the literature focuses on is relevance. So how can we find relationships between what they're learning in class and authentic applications of that learning? So what they find, the more you connect, the more you're going to see that bigger picture. The more students are going to be motivated, and the more that they're going to transfer what they are learning. So one quick idea would be to try using something like a mind map. So you're taking all the concepts and then you're linking them and showing connections. So that would be a simple example of something that you could use in practice. Focusing on the learner as actively contributing to this creation of knowledge is going to help them transfer what they're learning. Another thing that was mentioned was if you harbor and foster the expectation that what they're learning is going to be important and you relay that importance to them, they're going to be more likely to transfer it. And if you let them know that it's likely going to be useful down the road, same thing, they found that transfer was improved. So another idea from this idea of framing context expansively was to use a technique where you encourage learners to draw on previous knowledge. So it's related to connecting. You're connecting to what students already understand and know. One kind of caveat is to check for any misconceptions and ensure that they're drawing on a focused part of what they know that's going to help them understand what they are learning now. The other thing that they would talk about with this idea of framing expansively is providing a sense of accountability to the students, where they've got an active role and they're learning that their role is to generate their own solutions to new problems, and they're adapting existing knowledge. So they're becoming more accountable for their learning. All right, so another technique that we can use that's really simple to help students improve transfer is considering time. Like we've talked about, time is really important in terms of concept mastery. So if you allow enough time in learning, you're going to have time to look for those misconceptions and allow for that mastery. And of course, concept mastery is going to lead to improved transfer of learning. And another strategy we found in the literature was something called an invention activity. So that's where students are going to try something out first before teacher-led instruction. So an example of something would be like trying to find a general formula for calculating an average before you're taught how to do that in class. So the process is really quite simple. There's some time to invent. This may or may not be successful. Then there's the teacher-led instruction, so the showing part, and then there's the practice. So you're applying methods that you've learned to different types of problems now. So research has shown that adding this little bit of invention activity at the start improves transfer. And we might ask, well, why? What difference is it making? And a couple things they pointed out. So it's increasing the student's agency. They're learning from the failure, so they may or may not be successful, but going through that process, they're getting a greater understanding of the components of the problem and how they're going to interact at an abstract level. The other thing they found was that students were much more motivated when working on these types of activities. All right, so this one's kind of a general. If we try to provide more examples of concepts in various contexts, that's going to help students abstract the useful information and strategies from those concepts. So there's a couple different things that we could do. We could have learners solve a specific case and then use additional similar cases to help abstract principles. Or you could do kind of the reverse. You could start with a general case and then have the instructor help learners apply that to a whole class of related problems. So you're either going from kind of top down or bottom up. And through the literature, I was kind of wondering if there's one that's better than the other, and they suggest that a balance of the above may result in the most effective transfer, not one or the other. So another technique that is talked about in the literature, again, is related to those connections. So using analogy to teach is going to help improve transfer. What it does, it recognizes the higher order relationships that exist between two domains. And it's helping students draw on prior knowledge and give meaning to new info. So if they don't understand the new concept very well, maybe they understand something else very well, and we can link or connect it to that. There's a really great example of one they used in research. I don't have time to talk about it here, it's such a short presentation, but if you ever have a chance, Google fortress and tumor analogy problem. It's really interesting. So they found that in that research between the fortress and tumor analogy, that people often needed a hint or a bridge to make the connection. So just to show a quick example related to science curriculum. So with the analogy, you want to start with an anchor. So you're starting with something that the student already understands very well. So in this case, we're looking at a city. So students will have an understanding of how each part of the city works. And then you're trying to link that to the target situation, so something that they don't quite understand yet. In this case, it's going to be parts of the cell. And often, that will present clear relationships, but sometimes you're going to need a bridge between the two. So if something's not quite making sense as an analogy, then you might have to provide kind of an intermediate step or help with some of the links. The literature says, though, it's tempting to present this analogy, but it's much more valuable if you engage the student in the process of the reasoning. So how does this analogy work, rather than just going, all right, here's your analogy. Okay, so last one, learning to transfer. Basically, it's just going to take some practice. Students will, once they see that transfer is possible, they're going to start looking for, what type of information or rules or strategies like self-regulation, metacognition, or kind of just like domain-specific problem-solving techniques are relevant across different learning situations. They'll also start learning to identify when info might be useful again. So it's just kind of this idea of practice.
According to Zhang, Meyer, and Engel, all the instructor needs to do is connect the learning environment to other times, places, and participants in a way that his or her students will believe and be ready to act upon that material. Technology, then, can be used effectively to expand the classroom in temporal and spatial dimensions and to provide those opportunities. Technology can provide a media-rich experience. Students can use the media to explore the world around them that they cannot access in other ways. They can manipulate models or lab simulations and discover how quickly changing one variable will alter an outcome. They can connect environments. Those environments might be other classes. They might be connecting themselves to the world at large. For example, in a computer class, they might create a spreadsheet which they can then easily modify in a chemistry class to treat their lab data. And this is connecting those two environments. And technology also improves communication. And if you improve communication between teachers who rarely see each other, for example, the English department and the science department are in very different parts of the school in many places. Therefore, they never have the opportunity to talk to each other and to discuss, well, hey, I'm doing a written project in English and I'm doing a written project in science. Could we connect these in some way? If teachers can instantly communicate through email or chat, this would facilitate the opportunities for teachers to show students those connections and then to allow students to make those connections themselves. And it would provide opportunities for students to access skills they learn in one subject and apply them in another.
Challenges teachers face when helping students develop transfer skills. Challenge number 1, time. Covering too much material too quickly may cause problems. It takes time to learn a concept. Even the most talented individuals invest a lot of time to practice to develop skills. Covering too many topics too quickly may cause problems. Such problems include a lack of connections and organization of principles. Learning can't be rushed. Challenge number 2, foundations. Transfer is influenced by the degree of mastery of an original subject. Without it, transfer can't be expected. However, students may misinterpret new information based on previous information. For example, students may have a hard time understanding the concepts of subjects such as astronomy and physics because of their assumptions based on everyday physical experiences. Challenge number 3, understanding versus memorization. It is easier to transfer information and make connections to content students understand versus information that has simply been memorized. It is challenging to ensure that students are constantly understanding the information that is being presented to them. Challenge number 4, performance versus learning. Sometimes we focus too much on the end product of certain learning experiences, such as using a test or quiz, rather than how the students are learning. Transfer is viewed as an active and dynamic process rather than a passive process. Challenge number 5, motivation to learn. The amount of motivation a student has affects the amount of time that student is willing to dedicate to learning. Motivating students to learn can be a difficult task, especially when the student does not find the content interesting. Challenge number 6, finding the right balance. Finding the appropriate level of challenge to hold a student's interest can be difficult. If the content is too easy, it is boring. If the content is too difficult, it can be very frustrating. Finding the level of challenge that is just right for your student can be difficult.